and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Thank you so much for joining me. Tonight we are continuing my month-long May topic about planning. So last week's show, we talked a lot about using science and social studies as well as math and how to use long-range plans to plan that out. Now, the one thing I didn't touch on last week was how to plan language. So tonight we're going to look at all of the complexities of how to plan a language arts program, right on down to what your weekly schedule can look like and how you schedule out your language arts. So thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty. I am a 4-5 split grade teacher here in Ontario, Canada, and I come live every single Monday night. And this live broadcast is rebroadcast as a podcast replay on iTunes. And I am here talking about using inquiry-based teaching strategies in your classroom and how it has transformed my teaching and how I hope I can share how it can transform your teaching as well so that you can make learning fun and engaging for both you and your students. So like I said, tonight we are going to jump right into how to plan out your language arts. And I'm going to walk you through the step-by-step guide on how I structure my language arts program and how I fit all of those many moving pieces together, because sometimes it's a little bit hard to figure out how all of those language arts puzzle pieces go together. Now, where I teach in Ontario, I don't have a prescribed language curriculum that I have to follow. And when I say curriculum, I mean I don't have any workbooks or resources that I have to follow. I have my provincial curriculum standards, which are learning expectations that students need to achieve by the end of the year. However, what I have found in my experience is that students aren't always ready to accomplish mastery of any one language expectation at the beginning of the year. What I've found over my 12-year teaching career is that developing students' ability to read and write is something that happens slowly, it happens over time, and then it happens hopefully by the end of the year. But by structuring my language arts program more in a spiraled sense as opposed to standalone units where I say, teach one, how to write a fairy tale, looking at how to fit all of those language pieces together and figuring out how they all fit and how we want to get students to gain mastery over time. So they often need a variety of opportunities to try, and they need to learn slowly. So language development is really a slow burn. And what I was finding is when I was teaching in standard, say 6 weeks units, I would get really frustrated by the end of 6 weeks because my students simply weren't ready to write whatever writing form that I was teaching. Yet by the end of the year, they had started to develop more writing skills, and all of a sudden their work got a little bit better. So I wanted to figure out a way to allow my students to write in tandem so that their growth as writers in a variety of different forms grew throughout the year, as opposed to the forms that they maybe studied at the beginning of the year didn't ever get as well developed as some of the forms of writing that we were looking at the end of the year. So I'm going to try to switch over here to my slides. If for some reason you can't hear the slides, just pop in a comment below in the comments so that I know that you can't see them. So let me see if I can flip over here. Lovely. Okay, so let's go through how to plan my language arts. So the first component is language arts definitely encompasses a lot of moving pieces. So we have things like read alouds and shared writing and media and shared reading and listening and student-teacher conferences, spelling and grammar, giving students feedback, daily writing tasks, as well as speaking and guided reading and independent reading. So there is a lot going on when we are covering language arts instruction. And to try to fit all of those in, as well as fitting in the specific expectations, can sometimes seem a little bit daunting. So I like to break it apart in this way. So one is I look at my reading expectations and I'm using a gradual release of responsibility model. So I want to look at my read aloud, shared reading, guided reading, and independent reading tasks. And I definitely look at that as being a gradual release. So I have my modeled reading, which is my read aloud that I do every single week. I use picture books because they're quick, and I think we can get into a lot of different forms and a lot of different themes. There is still a place for novels in my classroom, but I do a lot of my read aloud activities are all centered around picture books. For shared reading, I really like using the concept of a paired text. So I like to make sure that I am choosing a shared reading that's often a nonfiction reading text that is related to the themes of the read aloud I picked for that week. And then a guided reading might be a similar themed story that's at different independent reading levels. And then for independent reading, I do allow my students to choose their own reading activities. For writing, I do think it's important that we're using shared writing activities, that we're modeling for students and sharing that opportunity with students to show them what the writing process looks like, how to write different writing forms. So I definitely like to use a shared writing, sometimes modeled writing, sometimes shared writing model, as well as I think it's really imperative that students will improve their writing skills when they can engage in a daily writing task. I think it's also really important to teach spelling and grammar. I definitely agree that we need to be teaching spelling and grammar in the context of learning, that it should not be kind of a separate aside, that we want to embed that spelling and grammar into the context of what we're doing as well in language. So I really like to use mentor sentences and pull those out of my read aloud that covers a grammar, spelling, or conventions, vocabulary issue that my students happen to be having or is required within my curriculum standards. And we're going to go through the linear step-by-step process that I go through to plan all of this out too. So just hold on tight. I also really like to embed my listening and speaking activities into my read aloud. When I'm reading aloud a story to students and I'm the one doing the reading, what I can be assessing for my students is their listening and their speaking skills, their ability to respond to questions that are asked about an oral text, and their ability to listen to the oral text as it's being read to them. That is often where I'm getting a lot of my listening, oral, speaking, and oral listening marks, is through that read aloud or the times when I am reading to my students. I also think there's times where we can weave in media in there, especially if we're looking at different concepts. I really do like weaving media into every strand, whether that's science, social studies, even within math, as well as within language. I think it's an important component to weave into a lot of different subject areas. And I also think a really big component of language is the ability to give students feedback, constant and frequent feedback on their writing. And I can do this through both guided reading as well as student-teacher conferences. So my 5 rules of teaching language, and these are the things that I hold dear, and these are kind of the philosophy of what frames how I teach my language arts, is number 1, reading happens every single day. And in the same breath, writing also happens every single day. I think it's really important that we are using the gradual release of responsibility model to teach, and we are also using mastery and making sure that we understand that mastery in language is going to happen over time. So it's not something that we're going to be able to accomplish really quickly and in a short amount of time, but mastery over teaching things like nonfiction or fiction writing, as well as mastering things like making connections and inferences, are not going to happen necessarily in a standard 6-week learning cycle. That it's something that we have to continually revisit over time and build on previous strengths and add more complexity to it as the year goes on. And number 5, and I think this is a big one for me, is I don't want learning to happen in my classroom in silos. So I don't want to make my language program feel like I have reading activities and then we stop and we put away our reading activities, and then we do writing activities and we stop and we put that away, and then it's spelling and grammar. I feel really disconnected and something just doesn't feel right when that's happening. So what I really like to do is I want to make sure that my reading is connected to my writing, which is connected to my oral and speaking and is connected to my spelling and grammar. I want to make sure that I am connecting all of those pieces together. And I'm often doing that through character trait themes, as I can connect different concepts throughout those 4 different strands: the reading, writing, oral language, and media. And I can connect those if I'm looking at covering thematic topics throughout my language instruction. So I like looking at my language in 100-minute blocks. So I have 100 minutes to teach language every day to my students. And this is how I break down that 100-minute learning block. So the first thing I do is to get them refocused after, say, a recess or a nutrition break, is I'm going to give them 10 minutes of independent reading. I'm not tracking the books they're reading. I will monitor to make sure that they're reading appropriate leveled books for their independent reading level, but I'm not asking them to write a reading log, and I'm not asking them to justify the book. I just really want them to be reading books that are at their independent reading level. And we will have conversations often at the beginning of the year to establish that what is your independent reading level and how do you choose just right books. The students start off the period reading 10 minutes. Then my students will come to me to a whole group area. In my classroom, that means they're coming to the carpet, and we will do a 20-minute mini lesson. Now, at the beginning of the year, these might be a little bit shorter as students are getting used to building up their stamina, but I try not to extend my lesson to longer than 20 minutes at a time. I find that students at the junior age level have a much difficult time extending that learning period and maintaining their focus. And I want it to be quick and brief and short. I don't want it to take too long in order to cover that one specific expectation or one specific learning goal that we're looking at during that lesson. Then students are moving into independent work time, and I use a literacy centers approach for this, and they have 3 literacy centers that they work throughout the week, and they do that for 20 minutes. And again, this is building up stamina to that 20 minutes. At this point in the year, some of them can even go 30 minutes, but 20 minutes is generally where I want them to be able to achieve, is 20 minutes of sustained independent work. And then I return and I do another mini lesson, this time focusing more on writing or even grammar and conventions. Finally, next they have their second literacy center where they're doing an alternate activity, and it's still one of those 3, either word work, writer's workshop, or reader's response. And then at the end, I either have missed time because transitions have taken us too long, or if I do have some extra time, this is the time where I'm going to be doing a novel read aloud that's going to be sustained over a while. Now, when I'm making my plan to teach, there's things that I want to structure so that I know where I need to plug these in. Now, these different activities aren't necessarily standard for each day of the week. I will play around with them and adjust what happens when. So I might not always do a read aloud first thing. If it doesn't make sense, I will move it. But think of these as just like movable sticky notes. I have 10 blocks of teacher-directed learning. And if I had 10 sticky notes and 2 of them said read aloud, I could really put those anywhere on my weekly schedule, but I'm going to have 2 lessons that are going to be dedicated towards a read aloud. I like reading the first half of the book, and then I'll read the second half of the book. Now, I do this because sometimes reading a whole book requires my students to sustain their to sustain their listening and attention for a little bit too long. I also really like to take a lot of time to stop and engage in think alouds or conversations, think, pair, shares, and getting my students to really think about how we think as readers. And I really model that when I'm working with my students, is I'm stopping every couple of pages to pause, to share with them what my brain was doing when I was reading the story, as well as elicit their responses about what their brains were doing. And I look at maybe there might be a trend within that picture book where it might lend itself better to, say, connections or inferences, but I definitely don't stick to just one. I think good readers use a lot of different comprehension strategies when they're reading. So when I'm engaging in a think aloud, I make sure I just choose whatever comprehension strategy makes sense at that time and model what that looks like and sounds like for my students, who that might not be something that they are strong with. So I have 2 read aloud sessions. Then I always have a session where we're looking at comprehension activity, reading behaviors, and this is also where if I need to do an explicit oral language lesson, I will fit that in. It's kind of a reading bonus lesson, if you would say, that I will kind of pick and choose what reading activity I need to do, whether it's more shared reading, whether it's related to the read aloud, or perhaps it's an oral language or even a media lesson that would fit well with what's happening in the week. And then finally, for a Thursday and Friday, that's when I'm often doing the shared reading. We're going through the text, annotating it, really digging into the text and pulling out, extracting information, and really thinking with our highlighters about the text that we're reading. And that's for my shared reading or a comprehension piece as well that's related to that shared reading. So I take the read aloud, and then with the shared reading, I might get students to do the same type of thing where they're making connections and inferences and predictions on what they're reading in the shared reading, but they're taking the lead on it with my guidance, versus the read aloud where I'm taking the lead and they might be helping me a little bit if I'm eliciting their response. But with the shared reading, I'm putting the student with some guidance, but they're doing more of the leading in terms of identifying the comprehension strategies they used while reading. When I flip into the second teacher-directed lesson, that's where I'm getting into writing. And I'm looking at teaching spelling, grammar, and vocabulary lessons that are areas of need for my students, as well as looking at different steps of the writing process. So how to use a graphic organizer, how to brainstorm, how to edit and revise. All of those activities would go in there if I'm looking at steps of the writing process, which I think is really an important part of teaching writing explicitly for the junior grades, especially as their skills as writers are beginning to develop more. And Thursday and Friday, I'm also looking at writing form and style. So this is where I might look specifically at a different genre of writing and explore it at a little bit of a deeper level. And I will do that over 2 periods. So if you think about your 10 teacher-directed lessons, if you're following this model, if you've got 10 teacher-directed lessons, you can plug them in kind of in any order that logically makes sense for teaching. But that is generally the process that I'm going through. So I do my read aloud, I have a comprehension and shared reading, grammar and vocabulary at the beginning of the week, and then I'm looking at the writing process and writing form and style. Now, during their student literacy centers, the students are engaged in 3 different activities. First is writer's workshop. I allow my students to choose whatever it is that they're writing. They get to choose the topic, they get to choose the form. They may have some conversations with me about their individual writing goals. If they're choosing the same form every style, I will direct them to try a different one the next time. But for the most part, my students have a lot of voice and choice when it comes to what it is they're writing about. I do this for a couple of different reasons. Number 1, engagement. Number 2, much easier classroom management because students love what they're doing and they're interested in what they're writing about. And 3, I think long term, it really gets students to develop their voice and understanding themselves better as writers. So I really like the idea of embedding a lot of voice and choice in my writer's workshop for my students. I will provide them at times with a choice board of writing for those students that struggle with, say, picking a topic or getting inspired with what to write. I will give those students a choice board or have that available to students so that they can choose different writing activities that they may be interested in writing so they don't have to come up from a writing idea from ground zero. And finally, and then I will do, spelling and grammar. So students will pick, practice, and test their individualized spelling words through the 2 to 3 sessions they have of spelling and grammar practice in a week. And if you find at the beginning of the year, sometimes I will make one of these activities, such as the spelling test, I will make that a part of our teacher-directed lesson so that students get used to that routine. And then slowly I will phase that out and replace that with a lesson. And then 3rd is the read and respond. Yes, Dawn, these are the schedule and ideas that are in the Ignited Literacy series. But you can do this yourself. So that's why I'm walking you through. So you can do this. You can use the stuff I'm talking about tonight, and you can definitely do this and follow this method on your own. And then 3rd is read and respond. So using the guided reading text, that I used with students during guided reading, I will have them choose that text and then do a read and response. And I'll give them a choice board, and they will be able to answer questions based on the text that they read. Now, while my students are working independently, I am busy doing other things as well. So in the first Student Literacy Center, I will see guided reading groups each session, so one guided reading group a day, as well as during the second session, I will use that for student-teacher writing conferences. Now, sometimes I need to spend more time with writing conferences, so I won't see students for guided reading, and other times I need to see more students for guided reading, so there is some flexibility there. Now, I said I was going to show you my step-by-step plan on how to pick out what to do for what to do and how to teach using this. So what do you do first? So the first thing you have to do is choose a theme. So I like character ed type topics. So resiliency or empathy, caring, compassion, all of those are great themes. And I will often choose a theme for a month or two. And if your school follows a particular character traits theme once a month, then this is a great way to kind of use those character traits and embed them into your literacy program. So number one is I will choose a theme. And this might also be related to, say, calendar themes. So November, you could do Remembrance Day. In February, you can do Black History Month. And I think April is Asian Heritage Month. So there's lots of different calendar type monthly themes that you can also choose. The first step, like I said, of planning out your language arts is to choose a theme. That's number one. So once you've chosen a theme, I like to go and find picture books that are coded, say, on Goodreads, or sometimes I'll just Google it for different books that are related to that theme. So if you're looking for compassion, I might find read aloud books that really show a nice theme in their writing about compassion. And if I have a book on remembrance or on war, then it might be a good book that I'm going to pick then. So the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to plan out, once I have the book selected, the third step is to plan out my think alouds. So I really want to look at what my think alouds are going to be, and I'm going to plan those ones out. Select read aloud, and then I want to plan my think alouds. So as I'm reading the book and previewing the book before I'm teaching it, what I really want to do is I want to plan what I'm going to say. I'm going to write them out, whether it's in a sticky note or in a page little chart beside it. But I want to look at what comprehension strategies I can focus on and model for my students, and also which ones lend itself really well. I would ask questions, make predictions, connections, inferences, and really model as those are happening what I'm thinking as I'm reading. Fourth step is to choose a nonfiction text for shared reading. So this is where I might look at themes, where if there is a topic covered in the story or there's an idea that might be presented, I can follow that. I can find similarities. So maybe a character in the story, I can find a real life hero that maybe emulates some of those same traits. And I will choose a nonfiction text that I can use for my shared reading. Now, some of the times I will simply I could find a newspaper article, and I will just take the text out of the newspaper article and format it so it's a little bit easier to read for students if I'm doing it personally for my classroom. Other times I will even take an article, do a bit of research for myself, and I'll write it for myself. The next thing I'm going to do is look at common errors that I'm going to look at the curriculum and choose a grammar focus that a lot of students might struggle with. And I will pull a mentor sentence. So this means I'm going to pull a sentence right out of the text, and I'm going to use that as a way to model appropriate grammar structures. The next step is I'm going to find a related story and use that for guided reading. So I'm going to take some of the independent reading levels that my students might have, and I'm going to pull those out and use that for guided reading. Then I'm going to create a reading response choice board for students, and I'm going to look at what it is that they can respond to, and I will give them perhaps a bunch of different questions. So I'll have a question that might get them to make connections or write a inference or look at asking questions or making predictions with the text that they read for their reading response. And I like to give them a choice for this because sometimes students are looking at answer some questions better than others. The next step is I'm going to create a fiction and nonfiction writing prompts that relate to the weekly theme of the text. And this is to help those students that need that additional support at figuring out what it is that they're going to write. And finally, as throughout this learning process in a week, this is what I'm doing in a week. I'm going to make notes and assess students on their strengths and needs. And I will be taking notes during writing conferences, through guided reading. I will be marking their reading responses and looking at what they're writing for that. I will be reading their writing and making notes on their strengths and needs as a writer, as well as perhaps even making notes if I'm assessing listening and speaking that week. I may make notes about their contributions and their ability to answer questions based on an oral text. So this is my process if I'm sitting down to plan out my week. Come up with a theme, then I pick my read aloud. Then I read through my read aloud and plan out my think alouds and comprehension strategies so that I can model those for students. Then I am choosing a nonfiction text that can pair well with the read aloud that I'm reading. Looking through my students' writing, I can find common errors that they're having and then look through that read aloud and connect it again to that read aloud text and really look at a sentence within that text that models it. So if I'm teaching about commas, I'm going to look for a sentence within that read aloud that talks about commas. If I'm teaching figurative language, I'm going to pull out a sentence in the read aloud text or shared reading text that really highlights a good figurative language sentence. And I'll do an activity that's related to that. And then I want to pull out stories for guided reading that are going to relate to that overall theme if I can find them, as well as then creating reading responses so students can respond to, creating writing prompts, and then making assessment notes. So that is the process that I use to follow how to teach language arts. And if you haven't done it before, is to go on iTunes and search up Teaching with Inquiry Live, and you can download and subscribe to the podcast so that if you do miss a live video, you can definitely listen to the edited audio, so you're not going to have all of the technical difficulties that you get when you go live, but you'll have all of that ready to go on your phone to listen to it on the go. So there's lots of different ways that you can catch Teaching with Inquiry Live in whatever way is most convenient for you. So thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for joining me tonight. And we will be back. Next Monday is a holiday, so we will be back the following Monday, the last weekend of May, to talk a little bit more about planning. So thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.